120 missiles, 7 minutes, and the most powerful naval fleet in human history, caught in the crosshairs of the most dangerous waterway on Earth. What happened in the Strait of Hormuz did not just shake the United States military, it shook every government, every defense ministry, every admiral and general watching from their war rooms around the world. Because what they saw, what the sensors recorded, what the satellite images confirmed, was something that military doctrine said should not be possible. Not against the US Navy, not against a carrier strike group, not in 2025, and yet it happened. I am Prof. Jiang Xueqin, and if you have been following global security for the past decade, you know that I do not use words like shocked the world lightly. But today is different, because what unfolded in those 7 minutes carries implications that go far beyond one fleet, one strait, one confrontation. This is about the future of American power projection. This is about who controls the arteries of global trade. And this is about whether the rules of military engagement, the rules that have governed great power competition since 1945, just changed forever. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you are going to understand not just what happened, but why it happened, how it was possible, what the world's most powerful governments are saying right now, and what comes next. And I promise you, what comes next is the part that should keep you up at night. Let us start at the beginning. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a body of water. It is the jugular vein of the global economy. At its narrowest point, only 21 miles wide. And through those 21 miles flows approximately 20% of the world's entire oil supply, every single day. Tankers carrying crude from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the UAE, and Iran all pass through this single choke point. Close it, even for 72 hours, and you do not just spike oil prices. You trigger fuel shortages, supply chain collapses, and economic panic across Europe, Asia, and the developing world simultaneously. Iran has known this for decades. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, has spent over 30 years building a military doctrine specifically designed around this strait. They call it the Mosaic Defense. The idea is simple and devastating. Rather than trying to match the United States ship for ship, which Iran could never do, you turn the strait itself into a weapon. You mine it. You position fast attack boats along its shores. You place mobile missile batteries in the mountains above it. You build underground naval tunnels. You develop drone swarms, and then you wait. Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Khamenei publicly stated years ago that Iran possesses the capability to close the Strait of Hormuz, and that Iran will use this capability if pushed to the edge. That was not a bluff. That was a declaration of military strategy dressed in diplomatic language. The United States understood this, which is why the Pentagon has maintained a continuous naval presence in the Persian Gulf for over 4 decades. The Fifth Fleet, headquartered in Bahrain, exists for exactly one reason: to ensure that no one, not Iran, not any other actor, can close the Strait of Hormuz. It is not just about protecting oil. It is about signaling to the entire world, particularly to Beijing and Moscow, that the United States controls the global commons, the seas, the skies, the trade routes. That signal, that declaration of dominance, is what those 120 missiles were aimed at. Now let me walk you through what happened, and I want you to pay close attention to the sequence, because the sequence is everything. The escalation did not begin on the day of the strike. It began weeks earlier, a slow burn that the diplomatic community watched with growing alarm. The IRGC had seized tankers near Iranian waters. US drones had been conducting aggressive surveillance runs along the Iranian coastline. Back-channel negotiations in Oman and Qatar collapsed without agreement. And then a specific incident, a US naval vessel's alleged intrusion into what Iran declared sovereign maritime space, became the trigger. Iranian state television announced that the IRGC Navy had issued formal warnings to the US fleet. The Pentagon released a statement disputing that characterization entirely, saying the ships were operating in international waters in full accordance with maritime law. 2 completely different versions of the same event. And between those 2 versions, a chasm that neither side was willing to bridge. What happened next was not spontaneous. Military analysts who reviewed the strike pattern later concluded that what occurred was a pre-planned, pre-positioned, coordinated operation. Iran had staged this for months. The strike came in waves. The first wave, fast, low-flying cruise missiles designed to overwhelm radar systems and close-in weapon systems that are the last line of defense on US warships. The second wave, arriving 90 seconds later, ballistic missiles launched from mobile platforms in the Zagros mountain range. The third wave, the wave that changed everything, advanced anti-ship missiles that defense analysts identified as variants of the Noor and Qatar systems, potentially augmented by technology that raised serious questions about Iranian capability that were not publicly known. 120 projectiles, 7 minutes. Against the most sophisticated integrated air defense network ever deployed at sea, the USS Carrier Strike Group activated every defensive system it had. The details of exactly how many missiles were intercepted and how many were not remain classified at the highest levels. The Pentagon released a statement that night that was notably careful in its language. It confirmed U.S. naval forces came under a significant missile attack. It confirmed the U.S. military responded forcefully. It did not confirm the number of ships damaged. It did not confirm casualties. What it said instead, and I want you to hear this, is that it would provide a full briefing to Congress in a closed session. A closed session, not a press conference. A closed session. In Washington's political vocabulary, that means what happened was serious enough that the administration did not want the American public to know the full details in real time. Reports that leaked through congressional staffers and foreign intelligence services watching via satellite painted a picture the Pentagon was desperately trying to manage. At least 2 U.S. warships sustained hits. One guided missile destroyer suffered damage significant enough that it had to be withdrawn from operational status. The casualty numbers, while not publicly confirmed, were described by one congressional source as more than what America has lost in any single naval engagement since the Gulf War. Think about that. The most advanced fleet in the world, the most expensive military in human history, and Iran, a country under decades of economic sanctions with a GDP roughly the size of Norway's, landed missiles on American warships in the Strait of Hormuz. The geopolitical shockwave that followed was immediate, and it came from every direction at once. Trump posted on Truth Social and said that the United States would respond with overwhelming and devastating force, that Iran had made a historic and catastrophic mistake, and that the days of the IRGC terrorizing international waters were over. He followed it with a phone call to Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu. The White House confirmed that call lasted over an hour. Israel's prime minister responded publicly by saying that Israel stands fully with the United States, that Iran's aggression proves the Iranian regime is an existential threat not just to the region but to the entire world, and that the time for half measures has passed. Israel's defense minister went further, stating publicly that Israel is prepared to act alongside its allies in any military response deemed necessary. Russia's foreign ministry released a statement almost immediately. Russia's foreign ministry said the United States bears full responsibility for the escalation of tensions in the Persian Gulf, that American naval provocations created the conditions for this incident, and that Moscow calls for an immediate ceasefire and diplomatic dialogue. Note the framing, Russia positioning the United States as the provocateur. That framing was amplified across Russian state media within hours. China's foreign ministry issued its own statement. China's foreign ministry spokesperson said China is deeply concerned about the situation in the Persian Gulf, that China calls on all parties to exercise maximum restraint, and that China firmly opposes any action that could destabilize the region. China's statement was notably more balanced than Russia's, which tells you something important. China's trade flows through the Strait of Hormuz, too. China is Iran's largest oil customer, but China also does not want a war that disrupts those flows. Beijing is playing a very careful game. Saudi Arabia's government called for regional stability, which in Saudi diplomatic language is roughly equivalent to saying they are terrified and want everyone to calm down immediately. Saudi Arabia knows that any major conflict in the Gulf directly threatens their oil infrastructure, their economy, and their internal stability. They are sitting on a powder keg and someone just lit a match. Pakistan's prime minister publicly stated that Pakistan is deeply concerned about any military escalation in the region, and that Pakistan's priority is regional peace. That statement was more significant than it appears, because Pakistan sits at the intersection of Iran, China, and U.S. strategic interests in South Asia. Iranian state television announced that the IRGC had successfully defended Iranian sovereignty against repeated American provocations, that the operation was a legitimate act of self-defense, and that Iran does not seek war but is fully prepared to defend itself. Iran's Supreme National Security Council released a separate statement warning that any American military retaliation would result in a response that the American people have never experienced before. That phrase, "have never experienced before," was translated and broadcast globally within minutes. Now I want to give you the deeper analysis, because the statements and press releases are the surface layer. Underneath them, in the intelligence agencies, in the war colleges, in the defense ministries, a completely different conversation was happening. The fundamental question every serious analyst immediately began asking was this: how did Iran develop and deploy missile technology at this scale and this accuracy without the United States knowing about it? The United States spends more on intelligence than any other nation on Earth. U.S. satellites provide near-continuous coverage of Iranian military installations. U.S. cyber operations have penetrated Iranian military networks multiple times. And yet, the full scale of what Iran had developed appears to have caught U.S. intelligence with a significant gap in their assessment. How is that possible? First, Iran learned from watching what happened to Iraq, Libya, and Syria. They learned that conventional military forces, fixed bases, visible assets, predictable command structures are catastrophically vulnerable to American precision strikes. So they buried everything. They built tunnels. They dispersed assets. They moved missile launchers on trucks through civilian areas at night. They built decoys. They made their military infrastructure look, from satellite imagery, as much like civilian infrastructure as possible. Second, Iran's relationship with China provided technological transfer pathways that were more sophisticated and more deniable than Western intelligence fully appreciated. Chinese state-affiliated companies do not sell weapons to Iran directly. That would trigger massive sanctions. But the transfer of dual-use technology, engineering expertise, and manufacturing knowledge, that is far harder to track and far harder to stop. Third, and this one is uncomfortable for American strategic planners, the sanctions themselves may have inadvertently accelerated Iran's missile development. When you cut a country off from importing conventional defense systems, when you make it impossible for them to buy aircraft, maintain their navy, modernize their armor, you force their defense establishment to focus all energy on the one area where they can innovate domestically: missiles and drones. Cheap, proliferable, increasingly accurate missiles and drones. The sanctions designed to weaken Iran's military actually shaped it, pushed it toward precisely the asymmetric capabilities that are most difficult to defend against. Now let us talk about the financial markets, because the economic dimension of this crisis is just as important as the military one. Oil prices spiked 40% in the first 48 hours after the strike. 40%. One of the largest single price movements in the history of the oil market. Shipping insurance rates for tankers operating near the Gulf of Oman tripled overnight. Major shipping companies began rerouting vessels around the Cape of Good Hope, adding weeks to journey times and enormous additional costs. The U.S. Treasury Secretary stepped forward and said that the United States is monitoring the economic situation closely, that the Strategic Petroleum Reserve is available for deployment if necessary, and that the administration is in contact with key oil-producing allies to ensure market stability. That statement was calibrated to calm markets. It did not fully work because markets understood what the statement was carefully not saying, which is that if this escalates into a sustained conflict, if the Strait of Hormuz is actually closed, no strategic petroleum reserve can compensate for that. The S&P 500 fell sharply. Defense stocks surged. Gold surged. The bond market began pricing in a scenario that most professional investors had considered a tail risk, a genuine military conflict with major economic consequences. Goldman Sachs put out an emergency note to clients saying that if the Strait of Hormuz remains contested for 30 days or more, global GDP growth projections would need to be revised down by at minimum 1 full percentage point. That note circulated through every major institutional investor on Earth within hours. Because here's the reality no politician wants to say out loud, but every government understands. The United States cannot afford a prolonged military conflict in the Gulf right now.
Not economically.
Not politically. Not militarily, in the sense that a major Gulf war would pull American assets away from the primary theater that Pentagon planners have been focused on for the past decade: the Indo-Pacific and the potential for conflict with China over Taiwan. Iran's leadership did not make this move without calculating that dilemma. Supreme Leader Khamenei has advisors. The IRGC has a sophisticated strategic planning apparatus. They understand American domestic politics. They understand the Taiwan equation. They understand that the United States in 2025 is not the United States of 2003, when it could launch a massive ground invasion with broad public support and a defense budget that felt unlimited. Iran calculated, correctly as events are unfolding, that the United States would face enormous constraints on its ability to respond. The question is whether that calculation produces measured de-escalation, or whether it produces an American response that feels it must be disproportionately large precisely to restore deterrence. That is the razor's edge the world is standing on right now. Let me walk you through the scenarios, because understanding the range of possibilities is more useful than pretending anyone knows exactly what happens next. The first scenario is controlled escalation and negotiated de-escalation. The United States conducts significant but carefully limited strikes against IRGC naval assets and missile infrastructure, designed to inflict real costs without targeting Iranian population centers or nuclear facilities. Iran absorbs those strikes, conducts a rhetorical response that satisfies domestic political audiences, and both sides engage Oman or Qatar as intermediaries to begin quiet back-channel dialogue. Oil prices stabilize. The strait reopens. The world exhales. This is the scenario most Western governments are desperately hoping for. It is also, historically speaking, the scenario that most often fails, because the domestic political pressure on both sides to not appear weak tends to overwhelm the rational incentive to de-escalate. The second scenario is a limited regional war. U.S. strikes are larger. They include Iranian nuclear-adjacent facilities. Israel takes the opportunity to conduct its own strikes, which it has been planning for years. Iran responds by activating Hezbollah in Lebanon against Israel, directing Houthi forces in Yemen to dramatically escalate attacks on Red Sea shipping, and activating proxy forces in Iraq and Syria against U.S. bases throughout the region. The strait is effectively closed for weeks. Oil hits prices not seen since the 1970s oil crisis. A global recession becomes not a risk scenario but a baseline forecast. This scenario has significant probability because each side has political and strategic incentives that push toward it rather than away from it. The third scenario is the one no one wants to say out loud, but everyone in the security community is thinking about: full-scale war. A conflict that once begun cannot be cleanly contained. Iran strikes Saudi Arabia's oil infrastructure, a target the IRGC has explicitly threatened for years. Gulf states see their economies collapse. Israel and Iran engage in direct, sustained military conflict. The Houthis blockade the Red Sea completely. Russia increases pressure on Ukraine simultaneously. China watches Taiwan. U.S. military assets are stretched across 4 crises at once. This scenario is less likely than the first two, but it is not impossible. And the events of recent years have consistently made impossible scenarios real. The fourth scenario, and I think it is the most underappreciated one in Western analysis, is what I call the Iranian deterrence success scenario. The United States, calculating the full range of costs and risks, chooses not to conduct a large-scale military response. It conducts targeted cyber attacks, imposes additional sanctions, pushes for a UN Security Council condemnation that Russia and China veto, and continues diplomatic pressure through intermediaries. Iran interprets this as validation of its deterrence strategy, and then other actors draw their own lessons. China looking at Taiwan, North Korea looking at South Korea, various non-state actors globally. This scenario does not produce immediate catastrophe, but it produces a strategic environment over the following 5 to 10 years that is dramatically more dangerous than the one that existed before those 7 minutes. Because the foundation of American global power is not just military capability. It is the belief that American military capability will be used, that the costs of challenging it will be prohibitive. If that belief is shaken, if the signal sent by those 120 missiles is that American naval power can be struck with limited consequences, then every adversary on Earth begins recalculating their risk tolerance. This is why a retired 4-star general who commanded U.S. forces in the Middle East said publicly that the United States is at a strategic inflection point, that the concept of deterrence that has governed American security strategy since the Cold War is being tested in a way it has not been tested before, and that the response to this attack will define American credibility for a generation. A generation. That word carries the full weight of what those 7 minutes actually mean. The immediate military situation is this: U.S. naval assets in the Gulf have repositioned. Additional carrier strike group assets have been ordered to the region from the Mediterranean. The U.S. Air Force has surged B-52 bombers to Diego Garcia, the staging point for American strikes against the Middle East. U.S. submarine assets are operating at elevated readiness. The military options are being prepared, refined, and presented to the National Security Council. On the Iranian side, the IRGC has gone to its highest state of alert. Iranian naval forces have deployed additional fast boats and mining assets in and around the strait. Iran's air defense network has been fully activated. And, crucially, Iran has communicated through intermediaries to Washington that any American military strike against Iranian territory will result in an immediate escalation that includes targeting Gulf state oil infrastructure and U.S. bases throughout the region. That threat is credible. That is the tragedy of this moment. Both sides are now in a position where every action has a plausible escalatory response, and the mechanisms for de-escalation are either broken, insufficient, or compromised by great power competition. What is needed, what every serious foreign policy analyst agrees is needed, is precisely what is hardest to produce right now: a genuine, sustained, back-channel diplomatic process. One that does not require either side to publicly capitulate. One that allows both Washington and Tehran to claim some form of face-saving outcome. One that addresses the underlying causes: Iran's nuclear program, the sanctions regime, the IRGC's regional behavior, American military posture in the Gulf, rather than just managing the immediate crisis. The problem is that this kind of diplomacy requires political courage that is in desperately short supply. In Washington, any sign of engagement with Tehran will be attacked as weakness and appeasement. In Tehran, any sign of engagement with Washington will be attacked as betrayal and surrender. Both governments are prisoners of their own domestic political dynamics, in ways that make the rational course of action extraordinarily difficult to pursue. And yet, the alternative is worse. Every professional strategist who has studied military escalation dynamics knows that the path from a naval confrontation in the Strait of Hormuz to something much larger is not as long as it should be. Miscalculation. Misunderstanding. A second incident before the first is resolved. A domestic political event that removes cooler heads from the decision. These are the mechanisms through which limited confrontations have become full-scale wars throughout history. The 120 missiles have been fired. They cannot be unfired. The world they have landed us in, this world where U.S. naval power has been publicly struck and the strategic consequences are still unfolding, this is the world we now have to navigate. And navigating it well requires something rarer than any weapons system and more powerful than any military strike force: clear-eyed understanding of what is actually happening and why. That is what I try to give you on this channel, every single week. Analysis without political agendas. Context that the news cycle does not have time to provide. Long-form, deep thinking that a crisis of this magnitude actually demands. If this video gave you something, if it made you think differently, if it clarified something you were confused about, then do one thing for me right now. Hit that subscribe button. Hit the like button so this analysis reaches people who need it. And leave me a comment right now answering this question. Do you believe the United States will launch a full military strike on Iran, or will back-channel diplomacy pull us back from the edge? I read every comment. I respond to as many as I can. Your perspective, from wherever in the world you are watching, matters to this conversation. I am Prof. Jiang Xueqin. Stay informed, stay sharp, and I will see you in the next one.